structures, you know, you should know the structures, all right? Drawing out the basal ganglia is pretty simple and straightforward. You should be able to, oh, darn it, I was supposed to have a drawing for you. Darn, and it's supposed to be 2 5-point drawings today. Think about it as we proceed. I'm sorry, totally tuned out on that.
I thought we did 4.
Nope, you got 2 drawings to do still. You only had 3 up to this point. I'm fairly positive, and there should be 5. So you got 10 points worth of drawings. You should be able to label the structures in here. You should understand the organization of the basal ganglia. The concepts of the striatum are critical to understand. So many inputs coming to and from the striatum affect so many different movement pathways. The lenticular nucleus is discussed frequently, and you should know that's the putamen and the globus pallidus, whereas the putamen and the caudate nucleus is effectively referred to as the striatum. Subthalamic nucleus, substantia nigra are those 2 inferior nuclei. You know, once again, looking at these figures, you know, it should help. You should have lots of points of reference. The thalamus is a great point of reference for absolutely everything. In many respects, the thalamus sits right kind of to either side of the central part of the brain, and it's important. Inputs to the nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens is really hard to place. It is a midbrain nuclei. A lot of times it's included with the basal ganglia, yet other times many authors don't include it. Association cortices, the amygdala, and those mesolimbic pathways, outputs of the substantia nigra, globus pallidus, ultimately to the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine, serotonin. This is that major piece of the whole reward system. This, you know, your dopaminergic pathways and some serotonergic pathways involved with reward, critical to understand. As a result, endorphins, opiates really affect this. This is really where addiction centers. We talked, once again, about inhibition and excitation. You really should be fully fluent in being able to explain inhibition and excitation and how it works. We have looked at a lot of neurotransmitters that are either inhibitory, excitatory, or some combination thereof. The synapse is really what the whole nervous system is all about. And being able to manipulate the synapse is important. You're going to all have patients taking a variety of drugs, and any of them that interact with the nervous system or with any glands are going to interact with synapses. Even if they're taking drugs that affect muscle, they're going to interact many times with synapses. And so understanding how you can affect the movement of signals at a synapse becomes really important. How do you up signaling? How do you decrease signaling? It's not simple. We talked about the tremendous number of receptors and how any given neurotransmitter, the action of that transmitter is many times defined defined not by the neurotransmitter itself, but by the receptor that it binds to. So you can have many different responses. Actually, you have multiple responses. And we see that. You know, I just want you to be aware of the vast array of receptors. Receptors are really important in understanding what goes on. And we start to see that as we look at this. Yeah?
If you don't mind me asking to make sure, what does the numbers mean next to the neuron?
The number of receptors. If you were to
Okay.
add up all the varieties in the right-hand side of that figure, it would add up to those numbers.
Oh,
Yeah.
Would you like us to know those numbers as well as like?
No,
Just
I
understand that there's multiple receptors.
Yes,
sometimes.
part of that is helping me show you the vast difference. Okay? I'm really trying not to ask you specific numbers of things. Now, as we look at how signals get through the striatum and through the basal ganglia in general, it becomes clear that you have to understand the concepts involved with inhibition as well as excitation. The pathways themselves are obnoxiously complex. You know, they're not the kind of they're not clear cut when you initially look at them. The direct pathway, you know, really, you can kind of just make this loop. Comes in from the cortex through the striatum, globus pallidus, between the various nuclei here up to the thalamus. The indirect pathway comes in, bounces around, loops back, goes in. So it's just semantics. How to get the signal from the cortex to the thalamus, thus back to the cortex. Remember, we have many different layers of control here. The basal ganglia are inhibiting a lot of movement. A lot of movement gets slowed down as it goes through here. As a result, when you have any problems affecting the basal ganglia, you're going to end up with one of two issues. One, you're going to have spastic movements. In other words, the movements are not going to be smoothly defined. They're going to be jerky. Or you're going to have a continuous decrease in movement and a loss of movement. This figure shows this schematically to you what the previous slide showed. You should be able to walk through here. The approach you should take in looking at this is, how could I explain what's happening in here? If you can explain what's happening in that figure, you'll be able to answer questions about it. Okay? So, yeah.
What is the role of the acetylcholine? I know it's like kind of like the junction.
Acetylcholine?
Yeah, it's like a exciting.
It's an excitatory neurotransmitter.
For both sides.
I'm sorry?
For both sides, for inhibiting
So-
pathway and direct.
Correct. Acetylcholine, almost 100% is excitatory. So
Would that be going from like the caudate to the putamen, for example? Or would
it
that
could,
be within-
it could, but it could be many times that there is within the putamen itself.
Okay.
Okay, the caudate.
Just the striatum.
Keep the striatum.
Okay.
All right, that's the best way. The signaling now. Let's go back to an earlier figure. See all these cross bridges in here? Okay, those are those signaling pathways that are going between the putamen and the caudate. And so those signals can go back and forth through there. So trying to tease those apart for you would be well beyond the scope of this course. But it is a good, interesting question, nonetheless. We walk through the different types of neurotransmitters. You can't, you really can't begin to fully understand, you know, the synapses involved here without understanding the various neurotransmitters. As I said, what you should do is you should be aware of whether they're excitatory, whether they have direct or indirect action. Excitatory or inhibitory, direct versus indirect. And we went through all of the different neurotransmitters looking at that. It's just one of those things, once again, weird things happen. So you have somebody who has attention deficit disorder or a hyperactivity issue. Now all of a sudden, they're taking amphetamines not to crank them up, but to wind them down. So the big question is, what's going on? What's happening in that case? Because let's say, you know, I don't know, you're taking norepinephrine, for example. Well, let's not use, I'm trying to go something, acetylcholine. It's excitatory. So if acetylcholine binds with a receptor, it's going to lead to a depolarization event, generating new action potentials, thus excitatory. All right. Now, if there's some weird aspect to the receptor, to the channel receptor, since this is direct action, it binds, we open something up, ions move. Now, if that receptor protein, instead of moving sodium or potassium, moves an anion, chloride, all of a sudden, instead of leading to an excitation, it's going to lead to an inhibition. That once you learn, once you really understand what's going on at the synapse with receptors, all of a sudden, aberrant situations, and someone who has attention deficit disorder or a hyperactivity disorder is technically aberrant. You start to understand how that same neurotransmitter binding does just the opposite of what it would do. If instead of getting a new action potential, you got a hyperpolarization event, and it wouldn't wind you up, it would mellow you out. And then it becomes understandable. You know, well, hopefully in your futures, you'll get to explain things to your patients, but you have to understand the basis of how to explain them. We talked about the various channels as they move through, whether they move through the putamen, the caudate head, the caudate body, nucleus accumbens. What's going on? What is it targeting? With the channels, you should know the inputs coming into the basal ganglia. You should know what the target is. So this is the cortical input coming from the cortex. This is the input site. So it comes into the basal ganglia here. It passes out of the basal ganglia here. What do you notice about this? It's all the same. It passes through various thalamic relay sites and then targets the cortex. This is understanding pathways. That's all it is. You've got the figures in your textbook that show you the targets. You know, and this is just a visual to go along with the table. It shows what's being targeted by the pathways. We talked about